Krell Dominion had conquered the galaxy with brutal efficiency for 300 years straight, and nobody could stop them when they decided a world would fall. Their warships moved through space like predators, hunting prey in every civilization that stood before them was crushed into dust within days or sometimes just hours of the first shot being fired. The Velthani Confederacy had been the latest to fall, and they were not weak by any measure of the word, because their crystalline bodies could withstand temperatures that would melt steel, and their technology had reached levels that most species only dreamed about achieving. But the Krell arrived in their system with 200 warships, and the Velthani capital world became a ball of molten glass in just 6 hours from the moment the first Krell destroyer entered orbit. Commander Dexal stood in the command center of his flagship, reviewing the battle recordings with cold satisfaction running through his enhanced nervous system like electricity through copper wires. The Velthani had fought hard, and their defensive platforms had actually destroyed 3 Krell frigates before being overwhelmed, but that was acceptable losses in the grand scheme of galactic conquest. Was not born but created in the genetic forges of the Krell homeworld, where scientists had spent generations perfecting the ultimate warrior race and removing every weakness that biological evolution had left behind us. Bones were laced with metallic compounds that made them stronger than most ship hulls, and his reaction time was enhanced by neural implants that processed information faster than any organic brain could manage them. Cybernetic enhancements covered 40% of his body and gave him abilities that natural creatures could never hope to match in 1,000 years of evolution. Every Krell soldier was like him because their entire species had chosen this path long ago. When they decided that survival meant becoming something more than what nature intended, their warships reflected this philosophy of overwhelming superiority, and each vessel was powered by captured stellar cores that provided energy levels no fusion reactor could dream of producing. The main weapons on a Krell battleship could crack a planet's crust from orbit, and their shields could absorb enough energy to power a small civilization for years. Thexel pulled up the strategic map of the galaxy and studied the remaining unconquered territories. With the focus of a predator selecting its next meal from a herd, most of the galaxy was already painted in Krell colors, showing 847 star systems that now flew their banner and paid tribute to the Dominion. Only a few isolated pockets remained independent, and most of those were either too far away to bother with or too poor in resources to justify the effort of conquest. But there was one region that caught his attention because it sat right in the path of their expansion and could not be ignored forever. The Terran frontier was what the locals called it, and intelligence reports said it was controlled by a species called humans who had only been in space for about 3 Centaurus, 23 star systems under their control, and a total population that barely reached 30 billion souls across all their colonies. Combinedthicil had conquered civilizations with populations in the trillions in technology that had developed over tens of thousands of years of continuous advancements. These humans seemed primitive by comparison because their fastest ships could barely reach half the speed of Krell vessels, and their weapons technology was generations behind current galactic standards. The tactical computer recommended allocating 40 warships for the conquest of human space, and Thexal agreed because that force had previously obliterated the Kelmorian Empire, which controlled 60 star systems. He selected his best commanders and briefed them on the mission parameters, which were simple and direct like all Krell military operations: enter human space and demand immediate surrender, then destroy any resistance and occupy all major population centers within 1 standard week. The fleet assembled at the staging area and prepared for the jump to human territory. While Dexal reviewed the intelligence reports one final time, humans were oxygen breathers like many species, and they came from a world they called Earth, which seemed to be a fairly standard terrestrial planet with normal gravity. Their government was some kind of democratic federation, which meant slow decision-making and probably internal conflicts that would make them even easier to defeat them. Psychological profile suggested humans were emotional creatures prone to fear and panic. When faced with overwhelming force, which was perfect for a Krell doctrinite, Dexal closed the reports and gave the order to begin the invasion because there was nothing in those files that suggested This would be anything other than routine. The fleet jumped into hyperspace and emerged at the edge of the Sol system where humanity had first evolved and built there. Civilization sensors immediately began scanning for defensive positions in military installations while communication officers prepared the standard surrender demand, but something was wrong because instead of the expected panic and evacuation attempts, there was only one ship waiting for Thema. Single human vessel held position at the outer boundary of the system, like a guard dog standing in front of its home. The ship identified itself as the TRSC Indomitable and classified itself as a heavy cruiser, which meant it was probably one of their larger military vessels. Thexel studied the sensor data and confirmed that, yes, it was indeed just one ship against his fleet of 40 warships. Tactical computer calculated that the Indomitable massed about 800,000 tons, which was respectable but meaningless. Against the combined firepower of the Krell fleet, his second-in-command asked if this was some kind of trap or diversion, but long-range scans showed no other significant military forces in the system. Most of the human civilian population seemed to be evacuating toward the outer colonies, which was smart, but also meant they had abandoned their homeworld. Thixel broadcast the standard demand for immediate surrender and expected the usual response of either acceptance or desperate defiances. The human captain sent back a two-word message that made no sense whatsoever in the context of the tactical situation. The message said negative withdraw, as if this single ship was actually ordering the entire Krell fleet to leave the system. Thexel checked the translation 3 times because surely there must be some error in the linguistic processing. But no, the message was clear. This human commander was demanding that they retreat from a battle they had already won before it even started. The absurdity of it would have been funny if the Zol was capable of humor, but Krell genetic engineering had removed such useless emotional responses. He gave orders for the Vanguard to destroy this foolish ship and then proceed with the conquest of Earth. As planned, 8 destroyers broke formation and accelerated toward the Indomitable with weapons charging and targeting systems locked on. Sexel expected this to be over in seconds, because 8 destroyers could reduce a mountain to atoms. And this was just one ship, but as he watched the tactical display, something happened that had never occurred in 300 years of Krell conquest. The human ship did not run away. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching the enemy fleet grow larger on the holographic display that showed tactical information in 3 dimensions. Her crew of 842 souls knew exactly what the odds were because the computer had calculated their survival chances at less than 1%, but survival was not the mission today, and every person on this ship had volunteered to be here when command gave the evacuation orders. Earth needed 12 more hours to get the last civilian transports clear and loaded with the children and elderly who could not make the journey in cryo-sleep. The Krell sent their demand to surrender, and Vasquez read it without any change in her expression because she had expected nothing different from an empire built on conquest. Her response was simple and direct, because there was no point in complicated speeches when actions would speak louder than any words. She transmitted back to words that summed up everything humanity had decided about this invasion. Negative withdraw. The communications officer looked at her with wide eyes, because telling an overwhelming enemy force to retreat seemed insane. But Vasquez knew something about humanity that the Krell would learn soon enough if they kept pushing forward into human space. Humans had evolved on a world that tried to kill them in 1,000 different ways, from diseases that wiped out entire continents to ice ages that buried civilizations. They had clawed their way up from caves to spacecraft through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible. Grandfather had fought in the colony wars when human factions nearly destroyed each other over resources and territory. He taught her that military service was about standing between home and war's desolation. No matter what the cost, the Krell did not understand this yet, but they would learn. 8 enemy destroyers broke from the main fleet and accelerated toward the Indomitable with obvious hostile intent. Vasquez gave the order that every crew member had been waiting for since they took their positions hours ago. Batteries fire and take us in. The Indomitable surged forward on full thrust directly toward the approaching enemy formation in a maneuver that looked like suicide to anyone watching. The tactical officer called out ranges and firing solutions, while the weapon systems came online with a hum that Vasquez could feel through the deck plate's humanity had one advantage that the Krell had not encountered before, because most species developed energy weapons as their primary armament, but humans had perfected the railgun to levels that other civilizations considered primitive and outdated technology. The Indomitable carried 48 railgun clusters along its spine and flanks, and each one could accelerate a tungsten penetrator 2.3% of light speed at those velocities. The projectiles carried kinetic energy equivalent to tactical nuclear weapons, and nothing could stop them once they left the rails. The first salvo fired, and the entire ship shuddered from the recoil. As thousands of rounds screamed toward the Krell formation, the enemy shields lit up as they tried to deflect the incoming fire, but energy shields were designed to stop particle beams and plasma bolt solid matter moving at relativistic speeds. Punched through those shields like they were not even there. 3 Krell destroyers took direct hits, and their hulls came apart like tin cans crushed by Hammer's atmosphere vented into space, along with debris and bodies, while internal explosions rippled through their engineering sections. Remaining 5 destroyers scattered and tried to bring their own weapons to bear, but the Indomitable was already inside their formation. Vasquez had studied every battle recording of Krell tactics that intelligence had managed to acquire from other species. Grell always relied on overwhelming firepower from a distance and superior shielding to absorb return fire. They were not prepared for an enemy that charged straight at them and turned the battle into a knife fight. Indomitable wove through the formation with agility that seemed impossible for a ship her size, but human engineering had always prioritized maneuverability point. Defense lasers created a web of light around the hull, cutting apart incoming missiles and damaging sensor arrays on nearby enemy ships. To more Krell destroyers fell to railgun fire before they could escape the engagement range. The remaining 3 retreated back toward the main fleet with damage reports streaming from their compromised systems. Vasquez allowed herself a small smile, because humanity had just bloodied the nose of an empire that conquered worlds with ease. But she knew this was only the beginning, and the real battle was yet to come. Main Krell fleet held position for several minutes while their commander presumably analyzed what had just happened. Then 20 warships detached from the formation and began their approach with weapons already charged and firing solutions. The Indomitable had taken damage in the first engagement, because nothing could survive that kind of close combat without scars. Hull breaches on decks 7 through 12 were sealed, but those sections were now exposed to vacuum. The starboard railgun clusters were operating at 70% efficiency due to damaged power relays. Engineering reported that the main reactor was stable, but running hot from the sustained high-output. Medical was already overwhelmed with casualties from the first engagement, and the doctor had set up triage in the cargo. Vasquez rotated the ship to keep damaged sections away from direct enemy fire, while her tactical officer worked on new firing solutions. Second wave came in more cautiously than the first, because the Krell had learned that the human ship had teeth they spread out to prevent the Indomitable from exploiting their formation, and concentrated fire from multiple angles. Bridge shook as energy weapons struck the hull and burned through armor plating that was never designed to take this kind of punishment. Vasquez ordered evasive maneuvers, but there was only so much a heavy cruiser could do against 20 ships firing simultaneously. She vented plasma from the reactor directly into space, creating a cloud that blinded enemy sensors for precious seconds. The Indomitable used that cover to reposition and fire another salvo of railgun rounds that caught 2 Krell cruisers by surprise. One of them lost its main engine and began tumbling out of control, while the other returned fire with increased intensity. Hours passed, and the battle turned into a brutal slugging match that neither side could win quickly. The Indomitable was dying by centimeters as damage accumulated across every system. Main power failed, and they switched to backup fusion reactors that provided barely enough energy to keep weapons and life support online. The crew was dead or wounded, and the corridors were filled with smoke and the smell of burned electronics, but Captain Vasquez still stood at her post with blood running from a gash on her temple that she had not bothered to treat. Her uniform was scorched and torn, but but her eyes remained focused on the tactical display. The Krell kept coming because they had committed too much to this battle to retreat. Now their commander had thrown his entire fleet of 40 ships at one human cruiser. It should have been over hours ago by any rational calculation, but humanity had stopped being rational the moment someone threatened their homeworld. Vasquez looked at the chronometer and saw that 11 hours had passed since the battle began. One more hour and the evacuation would be complete. One more hour and Earth's children would be safe in the deep colony she could hold for one more hour. She had to. The battle entered its 18th hour, and the Indomitable should have been destroyed 16 times over according to every combat simulation. Everyone, half the crew was dead, and their bodies had been moved to the cargo bay because there was no time for proper burial procedures during combat. Main power was gone, and the backup fusion reactors were running at dangerous temperatures that would normally trigger automatic shutdown. The medical bay had run out of supplies hours ago, and the doctor was using improvised materials to treat wounds that would have been simple to fix under normal circumstances. But Captain Vasquez still stood on the bridge with her command chair scorched black from a plasma fire that had swept through 3 hours earlier. Blood had dried on her face from the gash on her temple, and her left arm hung at an odd angle from a broken shoulder. She perfused medication because she needed to stay sharp and focused for what was coming next. Commander Thexal had finally committed his entire fleet of 40 warships to destroy this single human ship that refused to die. The Krell formation surrounded the Indomitable in a sphere of death with weapons firing from every direction simultaneously. There was no escape and no possibility of survival against that kind of concentrated firepower there. Tactical displays showed red everywhere as targeting systems locked onto the battered human cruiser from hundreds of different angles. Vasquez looked at her remaining crew members and saw the same determination in their eyes that had kept them fighting for 18 hours. They knew this was the end, but they also knew they had accomplished their mission. The evacuation transports had cleared Earth orbit 20 minutes ago and were already jumping to hyperspace toward the outer colonies. Every child, every elderly person, every civilian who could not fight was now safe beyond the reach of the Krell fleet. That was worth dying for, but Vasquez had one more card to play, and it was a trick that humanity had perfected through centuries of asymmetric warfare. Krell thought they were fighting one ship, but they were wrong. Every damaged section that the Indomitable had jettisoned during the long battle was actually a remotely piloted weapons platform. Vasquez had been scattering them throughout the battle space for 18 hours, creating a web of hidden threats. Krell sensors had dismissed them as debris because they were running on minimal power, and their signatures looked like wreckage, but each platform contained fusion warheads and guidance systems. Waiting for the activation signal, Vasquez entered her command code into the tactical computer and sent the final order to all platforms simultaneously. The voice was quiet but steady as she spoke to her crew one last time. "This is the captain, and all hands brace for impact." The weapons platforms activated across thousands of kilometers of space surrounding the Krell fleet in a perfect sphere. "You clear." Fusion reactions began in hundreds of warheads simultaneously as they detonated in a carefully choreographed sequence, though. Overlapping blast waves channeled into concentrated kill zones that had been calculated weeks ago when they first planned this defense. The Krell fleet found itself trapped inside a nuclear hellstorm that turned space itself into a weapon well. Enemy ships were destroyed outright as multiple warheads detonated against their hulls in synchronized patterns. More were crippled by electromagnetic pulses that fried their electronic systems and left them drifting helpless. Krell shields that were so effective against energy weapons could not protect against the raw physics of overlapping nuclear explosions. Thexal watched his fleet die on the tactical displays and felt something his species had not experienced in 300 years. Fear ran through his enhanced nervous system, like ice water replacing the cold confidence that had carried the Krell to countless victories. One ship had done this. One human cruiser with a crew of less than 1,000 had destroyed or crippled 30 of his 40 warships. Remaining 10 vessels were damaged, and their crews were in shock from losses they had never imagined possible. But the final detonations had enveloped the Indomitable as well, because there was no way to trigger that kind of massive explosion without being caught in it. Vasquez saw the blast wave coming on her sensors, and knew that her ship could not survive. The structural damage was too severe, and the shields were long gone. She gave the order to abandon ship, even though she knew most of the escape pods would not make it through the radiation. The crew rushed to their evacuation stations. While damage control teams sealed bulkheads to give them a few more seconds, Vasquez stayed at her post on the bridge because the captain always went down with the ship in human naval tradition. She manually broadcast the complete battle logs back to Earth on a tight beam transmission that would reach home in minutes. The data contained everything they had learned about Krell tactics, weaknesses, and technology. Future human commanders would study this battle and learn from either fingers moved over the controls, even as the bridge began to depressurize from hull breaches opening on all sides. The last thing she did was record a final message for anyone who would listen. Her voice was calm despite the alarms blaring and the groaning of metal. As the ship's spine began to break, we held the line and tell them we held the line. The transmission cut off as the main reactor containment finally failed, and the Indomitable broke apart in a flash of released energy. Escape pods scattered in all directions like seeds from a dying flower. Some were caught by the still expanding blast waves and crushed into atoms. Others tumbled away into the darkness with injured crew members inside, praying their distress beacons would be heard. At the Krell survivors began the slow process of regrouping and counting their losses. The seal stared at the tactical display showing the wreckage of what should have been an easy conquest. Career was over, and possibly his life, once the Supreme Command learned what had happened. The conquest of the Terran frontier was supposed to take 1 week instead. It had cost them 70% of the attack fleet in less than 1 day. He gave the order to retreat from Sol System and regroup at the staging area. The remaining Krell ships limped away on damaged engines while their crews tried to understand what had gone wrong. They had fought hundreds of species across thousands of worlds. None of them had ever fought like this. None of them had ever inflicted such losses on a superior force. Thexel began composing his report to the Supreme Command and struggled to find words that would explain the unexplainable. How could one ship crewed by primitive biologicals defeat a fleet of enhanced warriors and superior vessels? Answer was uncomfortable, and it challenged everything the Krell believed about their own superiority. These humans were different. They did not fight to win. They fought to survival. Apparently had no price to high. 3 days after the battle, a human search and rescue ship found an escape pod drifting in the outer system. Inside was Captain Elena Vasquez, barely alive, but still breathing. She had survived against all odds, just like her ship had held out far longer than any calculation said was possible. When they brought her aboard and the medics began treatment, she asked only one question: did the transports make it? When they told her yes, that every civilian had escaped, she closed her eyes and finally allowed herself to rest. The news of the Indomitables stand spread across human space faster than any transmission. Captain Vasquez became a symbol of resistance against impossible odds, but more importantly, the battle data she transmitted revealed everything about how to fight. The Krell humanity now knew their enemy, and humanity was preparing for war. The recording of the Indomitable's last stand played on every screen across human space within hours of the battle. Ending people watched Captain Vasquez stand her ground against an enemy fleet that should have crushed her ship in minutes. They saw the railgun salvos tear through Krell destroyers like paper and heard her final words about holding the line. But most importantly, military analysts studied every second of combat footage and learned exactly how to kill Krell warships. The footage showed that Krell shields were optimized for energy weapons and nearly useless against kinetic projectiles. It revealed their tactical doctrine of overwhelming firepower from distance and their lack of experience with close combat. Demonstrated that their ships were powerful but not particularly maneuverable when forced into defensive positions. Within 6 months, humanity's entire industrial capacity shifted to war production on a scale not seen since the colony wars. Automated shipyards in the asteroid belts worked around the clock, building vessels at a rate that seemed impossibly. Colony contributed materials and workers and manufacturing capacity until the entire species was focused on one goal. The Krell wanted a war, and if humanity would give them one, they would never forget but humans could not match Krell. Technology ship for ship, because the enemy had centuries of advancement and resources from hundreds of conquered worlds, so humanity did what humans always did. When facing a superior opponent, and changed the rules of engagement if Krell ships were individually superior, then humanity would drown them in numbers that made individual superiority meaningless. For every Krell battleship, humanity built 20 cruisers using simplified designs that could be manufactured quickly for every Krell. Cruiser, humanity built 100 missile boats that were barely more than engines and weapons. The human doctrine became acceptable losses, which was a phrase that made other species uncomfortable, but humanity had always understood that survival sometimes required sacrifice. Converted. Civilian ships bristled with hastily mounted weapons and sailed into combat knowing they might not return to mated vessels. With no crew at all, charged enemy formations to deliver their payloads before being destroyed. Some ships were literally just missiles with engines attached and basic guidance systems. It was not elegant and certainly not honorable by traditional standards of warfare, but when battles ended and analysts counted the wreckage, humanity always had more ships left than the enemy. First major engagement after Sol happened at the Kepler colony 6 months into the war. The Krell sent what they considered a proper invasion force of 200 warships. They expected to overwhelm the human defenders and establish a foothold in Terran space instead. They encountered 3,000 human vessels waiting in defensive positions throughout the system. Most were converted freighters and mining ships with weapons welded to their hulls. Many were remotely operated, so their destruction meant no human casualties. Some were exactly what they appeared to be, which was flying bombs waiting to get close enough to matter. The Krell commanders could not believe what their sensors were telling them. No rational species would commit resources to building thousands of cheap vessels instead of hundreds of quality warships, but humans had never claimed to be rational when it came to defending their territory. The battle turned into a nightmare for the Krell because their superior firepower meant nothing when outnumbered 15-1. They destroyed hundreds of human ships, but thousands more kept coming from every direction. Missile swarms overwhelmed their point defense systems, and railgun fire came from angles they could not cover. When a Krell battleship destroyed 10 human vessels, another 20 appeared to take their place. The invasion force was annihilated, and only a handful of damaged ships managed to retreat. Human survivors simply salvaged what they could and started building more ships. Sexel had been stripped of his rank after the disaster at Sol, but kept as an advisor. Because he had more experience fighting humans than anyone, he watched the Kepler battle recordings and tried to explain to the Supreme Command what they were facing. These humans do not fight to win territory or resources, he told the Krell leadership. They fight to survive, and survival has no price too high in their calculation. Krell tried different tactics because surely there must be some way to break human resistance. Deployed biological weapons designed to target human physiology specifically. Humanity had survived plagues that killed half their population before they even reached space. Every human colony had medical facilities capable of developing countermeasures, and the species had built immunity to diseases that would wipe out most civilizations. The Krell tried stellar bombardment, thinking they could destroy human worlds from orbit, but humans had been building underground cities and orbital habitats for generations. Destroying planet's surface just made humans angry and more determined to retaliate. The Krell even deployed temporal paradox weapons that were supposed to erase targets from the timeline, but humanity's quantum computers could calculate counter-paradoxes faster than the weapons could deploy. Every Krell advantage met a human counter that seemed to come from nowhere. The truly horrifying revelation came when Krell forces captured a human research station in the outer territories. They expected to find weapons development or ship designs. Instead, they discovered Project Ragnarok, and the specifications made even enhanced Krell warriors feel fear. Humans had been reverse engineering Krell's stellar core technology since the first battle, but they were not using it for ships. They were building weapons that could trigger stellar collapse and turn stars into supernovas. The calculations showed that humanity could destroy entire star systems, including their own, if it prevented Krell conquest. The data included target lists of human colonies that would be sacrificed. If the Krell pushed too far into Terran space, every colony on the list had voted to accept this fate if it meant stopping the enemy Thixil. Read the reports and understood finally what made humans different from every other species the Krell had. Conquered other civilizations, fought to preserve what they had built over centuries or millennia. Surrendered when the cost of resistance exceeded the value of independence. But humans came from a world that had tried to kill them for millions of years. They had survived ice ages and supervolcanoes and asteroid impacts that would have ended most species' surrender. It was simply not in their psychological makeup, because giving up meant extinction. The Krell Supreme Command held an emergency session to discuss the human problem. 300 years of conquest had never prepared them for an enemy like this. They held more territory than humanity and had superior resources and better technology by every metric they had used for centuries. They should have won this war already, but humanity refused to acknowledge defeat, no matter how many ships were destroyed or colonies lost Krell. Supply lines were constantly harassed by human raiders operating from asteroid bases in deep space. Small ships, and sometimes just individuals in combat suits, struck from the darkness and disappeared. Before retaliation could arrive, worlds saw constant insurgencies that tied down Krell forces and drained resources. The decentralized human command structure meant there was no capital to capture or a leader to eliminate. Cut off one colony, and 20 more kept fighting destroy their fleet, and they built another one twice as large. The war had reached a stalemate that looked nothing like the quick conquests the Krell were used to. They were bleeding resources and manpower in a conflict that had no clear end. For the first time in 300 years, the Krell Dominion faced the possibility of losing a war not through military defeat, but through sheer exhaustion, and humanity showed no signs of tiring, because this was what they had been doing since they climbed out of caves, surviving against impossible odds through stubborn refusal to quit. The war dragged into its third year, and both sides were exhausted, but neither would admit defeat. The Krell Dominion controlled more territory and had access to resources from hundreds of conquered worlds. Their technology remained superior, and their warriors were still enhanced beyond normal biological limits. By every traditional measure of military success, they should have won. But humanity kept fighting with a determination that seemed to border on insanity. Every Krell victory came at a cost. That made the next battle harder to win. Supply convoys needed heavy escorts because human raiders struck from nowhere. Occupied colonies required massive garrison forces because the human population never stopped resisting. The Krell found themselves fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited willingness to sacrifice. Small human ships attacked from asteroid fields, using the rocks themselves as cover in weapons combat. Suited marines struck at Krell installations and disappeared into cave systems or debris fields. Automated weapons platforms drifted through space on minimal power, waiting for targets to come within range. Humans had turned every rock and piece of debris into a potential threat. Meanwhile, humanity's industrial capacity kept growing despite the losses. Shipyards came online in systems the Krell had not even discovered yet. Factories built weapons and ammunition without needing rest or sleep. The human war machine was inefficient and wasteful by Krell standards, but it never stopped. The final confrontation began building at New Terra, which was humanity's largest colony world outside of Sol System. The planet held 15 billion humans and represented the heart of their industrial capacity. The Krell Supreme Command decided this would be the decisive battle. They committed everything that remained of their armada to this one engagement. 2,000 warships gathered for what was intended to be the killing blow against human resistance. Ixol was reinstated to command the fleet in a desperate gamble because he understood humans better than any other Krell. He studied the tactical situation and knew this battle would determine the war's outcome. If the Krell won here, humanity would be broken and forced to surrender. If they lost, then 300 years of conquest would end in defeat. Human response to this threat was predictable in its excess. 15,000 vessels assembled to defend New Terra from every corner of human space. Converted civilian ships and purpose-built warships and automated drones, all flying together. Among them was a new dreadnought called the TRSC, Indomitable, to built around the salvaged core of the original ship. Admiral Elena Vasquez commanded from the bridge of this vessel with the same determination. She had shown 3 years earlier her injuries from the first battle had healed, but she walked with a slight limp, and her left shoulder never quite regained full mobility. Had become a symbol of human resistance, and her presence inspired the fleet. The battle began at the edge of New Terra's gravity well with both fleets. Deploying into combat formations, Krell battleships took position to deliver devastating broadsides. While their escorts spread out to counter human numerical superiority, human forces divided into strike groups designed to overwhelm individual targets through concentrated fire. The first exchange of weapons, fire lit up space like a new sunbeam. Born railgun rounds and energy beams and missile swarms crossed the distance between fleet ships. On both sides died in the opening minutes as weapons found vulnerable targets. The Krell had learned from 3 years of combat and adapted their tactics. They focused fire to eliminate human vessels quickly, before numerical advantage could overwhelm them, but humanity had also learned, and their automated vessels acted as shields for crewed ships. Battle raged for 3 days without pause. Space became a grinder that consumed ships and lives without mercy. Debris fields grew so thick that sensors could barely track targets through the wreckage. Both fleets bled strength with every hour that passed. Krell lost their numerical advantage as human. Waves kept coming. Humanity lost thousands of ships but kept fighting with the survivors on. The third day both fleets were on the edge of collapse from exhaustion, and Lacestics looked at his tactical display and saw that victory was impossible. Even if they destroyed every human ship here, more would come from other systems. The war could continue for decades with no clear winner. Then something unexpected happened that changed everything. Admiral Vasquez broadcast a direct communication to the Exal. On a channel that only he could receive, her image appeared on his screen, showing a tired woman with scars from battles. "Past we can destroy each other," she said, with a voice that was calm despite the chaos around them. "More we can stop fighting, right? Now your people have conquered hundreds of species across the galaxy," she continued. "We are the first who punched back hard enough to make you bleed. Have learned that we cannot be conquered through force. We have learned that you cannot be completely destroyed without sacrificing everything. So here is humanity's offer, which is peace, not surrender, but actual peace between equals." Thexel sat in silence for a long moment, considering her words. The Krell had never negotiated with enemies before because surrender was the only acceptable outcome, but this enemy had proven they would die before surrendering, and continuing the war meant bleeding the Dominion dry of resources and warriors. He made a decision that no Krell commander had made in 300 years. He opened a channel to the Supreme Command and recommended accepting the human offer. The reactions were predictable, with outrage and accusations of cowardice. But Thexol explained the reality of their situation with brutal honesty. Could fight humanity for another decade and maybe win, but the cost would destroy the Krell Dominion as thoroughly as any defeat. Conquered species were already watching this war and learning that the Krell could be resisted if humanity survived. Then rebellions would spread across the entire Dominion. The only way to preserve what they had built was to accept that some species could not be conquered. The Supreme Command debated for hours while the fleets waited in uneasy tension. Finally, they agreed to negotiate terms. The Treaty of New Terra was signed aboard a neutral station with representatives from both sides. No reparations were demanded because neither side could claim complete victory. No territory changed hands because the cost of occupation was too high. Just borders and mutual recognition, and a non-aggression pact that both sides would honor. The Krell Dominion faced something they had not experienced in 3 centuries. An equal peer who could not be intimidated or conquered. Humanity gained recognition as a sovereign power and breathing room to rebuild them. Years following the treaty brought unexpected developments. Other species who had been conquered by the Krell saw that resistance was possible. Rebellions began on a dozen worlds. As enslaved populations rose against their masters, the Dominion fractured as it tried to maintain control over an empire built on Fort Sexel. Retired from military service and wrote extensively about the human war, his writings became required reading for Krell officers and included warnings about underestimating opponents' humanity. Meanwhile, became the rallying point for a new coalition of free worlds, not an empire, but an alliance of species, who chose cooperation over conquest. Admiral Vasquez Eventually retired and the Indomitable II was decommissioned after years of service, the ship became a museum orbiting Earth where millions visited each year. We walked the corridors where 842 souls held the line against. Impossible odd-schooled children touched the scorched hull plates and read the names of those who died. The ship's motto was engraved above the bridge entrance in letters. It's large enough to see from across the hangar. We do not yield. Those 3 words became humanity's creed in the galactic community. Other species learned that humans could be negotiated with and traded with and befriended, but they also learned that humans would fight to the death rather than submit to conquests. The Krell never attempted another invasion of human space. They had learned their lesson at a cost of thousands of ships and warriors. Some species can be conquered with ease, but humanity was not one of the men that made all the difference in a galaxy where strength had always determined survival. The peace held because both sides understood the alternative war without end until one or both civilizations collapsed into ruin. It was not the peace anyone wanted, but it was the peace everyone could live within. Sometimes that was enough.